Yeah, so, well, thank you for the introduction. Like Stephanie said, my name is Mike, and I'll explain what I mean by money as a language later on. It will hopefully make sense, and if it doesn't, then we can try to elaborate. So, diese Präsentation ist auf Englisch, aber wenn jemand eine Frage auf Deutsch stellen will oder so, ich kann versuchen zu verstehen. So I'll try. I want to include the German speakers here, but it's much easier for me if we speak in English. So, sorry. So yeah, the grammar of money in social change. So I run a company called Evolve on Purpose. And what I do is I help people and organizations who are committed to solving systemic problems, so addressing complex systemic challenges, find strategies to do so. So I usually don't have any answers for them, but I bring them through processes, through coaching, writing, strategic facilitation, to help people who are tackling these really tough challenges figure out how to find the rungs on the ladder to make progress. So I work on lots of different issues, from rural water in Africa to designing a process to help cyclists and drivers build more trusting relationships in Canada. So lots of different things. And for many years, I've been obsessed with the question of money and how do you bring money into systemic change. So systemic challenges that have their roots in power structures, the assumptions that we make, the systems that we have set up about how we interact and who has power, all of this type of stuff, it's very hard to address these types of issues. You often need to do a lot of experimentation. You don't necessarily know where you're going when you start if you're trying to convene a project around this type of issue. And the question of who pays for systemic change is one that keeps coming up again and again. Everyone I work with is always asking this question. So, whose job is it to save the oceans? There's organizations that try to do that, but whose wallet pays for it? It's a big challenge. When you're looking at something very complex, for example, addressing addiction in Canada's Indigenous communities, also very complex. You need to experiment, you need to explore, you need to build relationships to really address it in a robust way. Who pays for that? There's some money for it, but in the grand scheme of things, if you look at how big these challenges are and how many there are, whose job is it to pay? This is the question that I've been carrying around for years. And at some point last year, I met someone who was also asking this question. And there are many people asking this question, but this fellow, Suresh Ferrando, was asking it in a similar way to what I was doing, and he was trying to figure out how to actually innovate on this problem. So Suresh had a background in finance, and he switched his career into becoming a social change activist, and he helped organize the Occupy movement. So he made a pretty big change. And he and I were working on a prototype idea set in Vancouver for a new financial instrument that would basically allow early-stage experimental social change ventures to enter a cooperative, have the cooperative funded as a collective, and then have that money allocation governed by the co-op as opposed to by the donors. And so instead of competing over the same resources, they would come together and have a cooperative governing model for the resources. That prototype didn't get very far because unfortunately Suresh in February passed away, which was a bit of a shock. He was a friend of mine, and I decided that because this is a question of interest to me and it's interest to all my clients and collaborators, I would keep going with the research and engagement work that we'd started, even though our project is not going to go anywhere anymore because we lost Suresh. So I've been speaking to lots of people about this issue, people in my network, my clients. I've done a lot of research on this question of how to bring money into systemic change. And I have learned some things, which I will share. And I have a whole bunch of things that I don't know, which I will also share. So hopefully we can learn something more together. So Suresh and I were both very passionate about pie charts. So I decided to include 3 pie charts here. And the first one talks about the capital that we have in the world for doing things and what its priorities are. So this pie chart contains no real numbers. This is just to make a point. But basically, if you look at all the capital that gets invested in initiatives, in ventures, most of it is motivated by, it prioritizes a financial return. A minority of it prioritizes a social or environmental change return, and then you have things that are mixed. So social enterprise investing, a lot of things that government does. So there's a lot of money out there. Most of it is mostly interested in financial return. So that's the first thing. The second thing that the second proposition I'll make is that of the challenges that we face, that humanity faces, the social and environmental challenges, most of them are complex and systemic, and a minority of them are not complex and not systemic. So things like climate change, water stress, inequality, the challenges faced by displaced peoples in conflict zones and in disaster zones, unsustainable food systems, the decline of journalism in the post-fact, Donald Trump world that we have now. These are all issues that have isolated causes and connected causes. There are many different ways of making sense of the issue, even though all of us are probably on a pretty close on the political spectrum. We would probably disagree about the decline of journalism, for example. So these are very complex issues, and they're about systemic structures. And I would say that most of the issues that the people that I work with concern themselves with, so things like poverty and inequality, are complex and systemic, and a small number of them are simple or just complicated. So that's the character of our challenges, and then we can look at the character of the resources that we currently have to address those challenges. And most of those resources are focused on funding answers. So most of the resources that we have to invest in social and environmental problems, and I say this in very general terms, but this is different in every context, but I think it is a general truth as well. Most of it was designed in systems that were there to fund answers. So you have a challenge, your community is hungry, give them food or teach them to farm. People are poor, teach them entrepreneurship skills. Your community has an addiction problem, set up a treatment center. Most of our institutions of money were designed to fund answers. A small amount of this resources is designed to fund questions. So instead of saying, I will set up a treatment center because my community suffers from addiction, the question would be, how can I relieve my community from addiction? So most of the resources that we have is based on funding answers. And for the small amount that is based on funding questions, a lot of it is academic. So if you did research on the question of how could you address addiction in a community, there would probably be resources for the academic side of that. But if you wanted to learn by doing and actually experiment and learn in that context about how to do that, there's minimal resources for that. So these are the general ideas I have about money, and I'll get to the language thing in a minute. So when I talk about a challenge being complex, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, I'm borrowing some language from a friend and a collaborator of mine named Zaid Hassan, who basically identifies complex challenges as having three properties. The first is that it's emergent. The properties of the challenge, the shape and structure and how it behaves, arise from the interactions of many different parts. And that causes it to be unpredictable and have unclear causality. So you don't know, for example, coming back to the addiction example, you don't know at the beginning that what you do will have a certain effect. If you know that a treatment center had a certain effect in one community, you don't necessarily know that it will have the same effect in a different community because the emergent properties are different. Different people, different context, different time. The other property is that they're dynamic. They're constantly changing. And the shape of the challenge is always transforming, and new information is constantly being produced about the challenge. And then the third property is that they're adaptive. The people who experience these challenges are always changing their behavior based on new information. Everyone who's involved with it is constantly changing their behavior. And it creates a feedback loop because the adaptive behavior changes how people behave, which then creates new emergent properties, which then, again, feeds the dynamism. So this is the cycle of complexity, basically. So the consequence of this, if you believe this thinking about what complex challenges look like, is that every situation is essentially new. Just because you know something about how to address addiction in this community doesn't necessarily mean you know very much about how to address it in this different community, or even at different points in time. What might have worked 5 years ago might not work anymore because everything's always changing. So this is sort of a radical proposition, and this is overstating it, I think. It's not that everything is always new. There are things that we know that stay true forever. But I think my bias is sort of to say that every time you have a new social environmental challenge, you almost have to start from scratch in terms of thinking about how to solve it, because every context is so different from every other context. So the proposition, and the reason that the funding questions versus answers things matters is because since every situation is essentially new, strategies to address complex and systemic challenges have to be oriented around questions. So if you want to address addiction in the community, you need to come in asking the question, how do I address addiction in this community? Not giving the answer, I'm going to build a treatment center. The questions also have to be answered through experimentation. So you don't necessarily know through academic research what will work in the community. You will learn something about that, but the most robust way to do it is through experiments. And people in the private sector have known this for a long time, right? That's why venture capitalists expect that 90% of what they invest in will fail. So people in the social sector tend to be held to a different standard. If you're doing something, if you're addressing addiction in a community, you better get it right the first time, otherwise you're not going to get funding next time. But if you're a private venture, then it's a different story. But you have to experiment, and these experiments have to be conducted with the people who experience the challenge. So not just a group of experts talking about addiction in this community, but the community members themselves participating in that experimentation. So we need to orient our strategies for addressing complex challenges around questions, but most of our resources are focused on funding prepackaged answers implemented by others. That's what most of our funding institutions were designed to do. And this has started to change. The way that we talk about social challenges is indeed changing. So most people in this room probably know about the rapid rise in labs, things that call themselves labs, maker labs, fab labs, social labs, change labs. There are thousands of them now around the world, whereas there were a handful of them only 10 years ago. And Zaid calls this the social labs revolution, but there's lots of different names for it. And a lot of these labs are basically just using the word lab, because the word lab is trendy and it's fashionable, but there's also some really wonderful work being done where people are trying to tackle challenges through a questions-focused process. But my concern, basically, and kind of the topic that I'm focused on here, is that even though our language is starting to move towards this complexity-focused world where we talk about experimentation and emergence and collective action and multi-stakeholder issues, this sort of stuff, our systems of money are lagging behind. So we use the word lab, and there's lots of things that are funded as labs. Even the really great labs that are out there that really are focused on questions don't have long-term funding. They often don't know what their sustainable business models are going to be if one exists. We have this systemic challenge, I think, around money, where our systems of giving, basically, our systems of investing in social and environmental challenges have not gone through a revolution, even if our thinking about how those challenges need to be solved is starting to go through that revolution. So this sort of lag is the challenge that I'm focused on here. And this is where the idea of money as a language hopefully becomes useful. So one of the things that I've come to realize in my work with different clients working on complex issues is that money is a language that is spoken between people. So money and language have a lot of things in common. They're both arbitrary social constructs. So this, what is this, a remote? Yeah, well, let's call it a remote. This thing is only called a remote because you and I both agree that that's what it's called. And this, what is this, €2 only has value because we all agree that it has value. It's an arbitrary social construct. The way that we use money and the way that we use language both co-evolve with our values as well. So there was a time when it was okay to use racial slurs or to use demeaning terms to talk about homosexuals. But values change, people change, and our language changes as well. The way that we can talk about certain things and what we consider acceptable changes. Money also co-evolves with our values. So things like whether it's acceptable for a nonprofit organization to draw a profit, whether charitable donations are tax deductible. These types of things also change. Whether we think bribery is okay, whether we think campaign contributions in elections should have limits or whether they should be unlimited. The rules that we assign to money change with our values, just the same way that the rules that we assign to our language change with our values. And finally, the third thing they have in common is that the way that we use money influences our relationships in the same way that the way that we use language does. So I could speak to you very rudely, or very abruptly, or very arrogantly, and you and I would have a different relationship than if I spoke to you with warmth and love and caring. On the money side, I could choose to tip, I could choose to overcharge my clients, I could choose to underreport my income to the government. There's these choices that I make that about how I spend money have this in common with the choices that we make around language. And the reason that I think this is a useful way of looking at money is that we can start to then learn from social movements who have focused on language in learning about how we have to change our systems of money. So social movements like the LGBTQAI movement, Black Lives Matter, even the Tea Party, which is a social movement in a direction that I don't agree with, but it is a social movement and how it's structured. All of these things focus a lot of energy on changing how we talk about issues. A good example from the right, actually, like the conservative end of the spectrum, is how it used to be called in the United States tax reduction, and now it's called tax relief. And even the Democrats in the States use these words tax relief. And when you call it tax relief, you're implying that there is a burden that needs to be relieved, that taxation is something that happens to you that is bad. And that becomes part of our psyche, right? Like the way that we speak about things becomes part of how we see the world. Social movements understand this, which is why, for example, the transgender rights movement focuses on pronouns. Do I say he or she, or can I say they and them? In English-speaking countries anyway, this pronoun thing is quite important. So social movements know a lot about the fact that our spoken language influences our society because it shapes our systems of power. And the question that I'm interested in is, how does our money language shape our systems of power? How do the assumptions that are made about how money should be used, what it can be used for, and what do we expect that we are entitled to when we spend money on something, shape the systems that we have that address the challenges that we face? So this might be a little confusing, but I hope it will become clear in a moment. And I'm going to show a couple of videos that will hopefully clarify some of this. But I wanted everyone to do a quick reflection, actually. How am I doing for time? Yeah. And I'd like you to think about a time that you got money, either for a project or from your parents, from a friend, or maybe an investment from a grantor or an investor or something like that. And getting that money made you feel creative and empowered. I'd also like you to think of a time when getting that money made you feel constrained and limited and held to a certain behavior that you didn't necessarily know you wanted to do. Just curious, can anyone think, can you raise your hand if you have examples of either of those things that you could think of? One? Okay. Well, so an example for me is when I used to be the country director of Engineers Without Borders in Malawi, and at some point my program got money from GIZ, and that was extremely empowering because the relationship that I had with GIZ, that my team had with GIZ, was one where they really valued the experimentation that they were doing, and the only outputs that they were expecting from us was really good learning and then good documentation about how we spent it. But when I've received money from UNICEF in the same program, it made me feel nervous because it made me feel like I was locked in, my program was locked into doing something. And if we learned later on that what we wanted to do was actually totally different because we got new information or things changed or we wanted to adapt, we wouldn't be able to do that. So this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Anyway, I'm going to show a couple of videos here and then sort of use these as examples to illustrate what the power of speaking a different money language can be. So this first one is from a social lab in Chicago called the Grove 3547. And this is a lab that brought together different community members in Chicago and community foundations and different stakeholders in the community to basically look at the question of how can we empower youth in Chicago to build resilient livelihoods. And this is a video about one of the prototypes that emerged from that lab. Is the sound?
Yeah, and they had something that was being described as a gymnasium. And black people didn't know what was supposed to go on in a gymnasium. And this game called basketball that emerged through the YMCA movement, black people at that particular time were not aware of the game of basketball because coming from Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, as a sport and recreational activity, we played baseball.
One thing that we're trying to accomplish with our team is to preserve the history of Bronzeville.
We came under the premise that young people don't have a sense of history, knowledge of the heritage that is rich in the culture that is rich in Bronzeville and the things that Bronzeville has birthed.
We're going to have young people interviewing these stakeholders and torchbearers that are in the Bronzeville neighborhood so they can get that experience as well.
Initially, we were thinking something around science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, or STEAM, but we landed in this rapid prototyping kind of notion around film and digital media through video and film and photography and oral storytelling. And so we thought that we could use those methods to bring all of these concepts together.
There's a disconnect between the generations. A lot of people don't know the history, and this is a way to get the history out.
Okay, so that was one, and then here's the second.
What do you think it takes to build a business? What do you think it takes to tackle some of the hardest human problems?
Can you hear it?
And what kind of person do you think leaves what they're doing right now to actually pick up something else to follow their purpose? Whoever you are, if you're asking the hard questions about how daily actions make up meaningful lives, and if you're thinking about how global problems are affecting small communities, then we want to talk.
So we are Lifehack. We bring people like you together to kickstart tech projects with a social purpose.
We love simple technology, like text messaging services that help young women in rural communities, and complex pieces of technology, like mood tracking apps and music apps that help you regulate your emotion.
New Zealand has huge potential, but we're facing complex social problems.
Young people across New Zealand have told us that they want to help us solve these big issues.
We run Lifehack Labs, a 5-week full immersion course based in Wellington.
We're looking for 20 of the brightest minds who want to have meaningful impact in the world and are willing to work collaboratively to do it. Labs is fully funded with world-class mentors and accommodation provided for out-of-towners.
In the first 2 weeks, you'll find a team that you love working with, and you'll define an issue that you want to work on. In the last 3, you'll be developing your ideas and prototyping them, giving them a go, seeing what the feedback is, and iterating from there. You'll exit the lab with a team, a plan, and whatever structure may suit your piece of work. You might build a charity in the lab, you might build a company in the lab. Whatever you build, you'll be in charge of, and you'll be able to take charge of your own future because you've built it together.
Labs is funded by the Ministry for Social Development and brought to you by Inspiral.
You apply as yourself and leave as a team with a plan of what you want to bring out into the world.
Whatever your skills are, bring them to the table. Apply at labs.lifehackhq.co. Head to the website now.
So I had a third example as well I was going to show, but I didn't for time, but it was an open innovation hub that was convened by WWF Switzerland. And the question that I'm interested in here about the money thing is, what do these have in common, the two things that you just saw? Like I said, the first one, that was not the entire initiative. That was only one prototype that emerged from the broader lab. There were 4 other prototypes, and those are still being developed. And there were a wide diversity of things, from restorative justice to art and culture and to a music recording studio. So that was just one of the prototypes. So for both of the things that you saw there, they had a few things in common. One is that they created spaces that allowed for different types of prototypes, so experiments with many different things bound by a common purpose. They had a clear process and powerful storytelling, so they didn't have a specific plan at the beginning, but they had a very clear process in mind about what they wanted to go through that was going to lead to these things. They created space for learning through experimentation, involving people who experienced the challenge. And a very important thing, I think, was that the money language spoken between those who were funding the lab and those who were implementing it was speaking the language of complexity. It was the questions that were funded, not answers. So with Lifehack, the question that was at the beginning was something along the lines of, how can we support the youth of New Zealand to be leaders in mental health and well-being? In Chicago, with the Grove one that you saw, the first one, the question was even more vague than that to begin with. It was basically, what can we do with youth in Chicago? And then through part of the process, after there was already money being spent to go through a process of design and thinking, it focused on how can we empower youth to build resilient livelihoods in Chicago, something along those lines. So they started with questions. And the questions were there with the funders. The people who were investing in these things were, when they were speaking about budgets and when they were talking about how money was going to be spent, it was all very strategic, and it was all in service of answering the question through experimentation. It was not as much about exactly what line items are going to be in your budget. So they were funding questions versus funding answers. So what's the difference between funding answers and funding questions? Well, funding answers tends to avoid complexity. The questions, when it comes down to money in the interaction, are about what's the plan, what product will be delivered, who will do what, when, and with what cost, how will I be recognized, and is this nonprofit or for-profit? Basically separating we invest in charities versus we invest in social enterprises. And they're often about investing in single projects that are well-defined with rigid budgets that don't flex, focus on delivery of a product, and the idea of overhead, so funding, administration, and salaries and that type of thing is seen as bad. Funding questions, instead of avoiding complexity, it accepts complexity as a natural part of the world. It doesn't even make a judgment as to whether it's good or bad. It just is. It's like air or gravity. It's just part of life. And the questions that come up when you're talking about money, when you're focused on funding questions, are around what's the process, what's the vision, who are you engaging, how do you hope to create value, and how can I help? And these tend to be focused on ecosystems of interventions, recognizing that answering a question like, how do we engage youth to build resilient livelihoods in Chicago, is not going to be just about one thing. It's going to be about multiple experiments. The budgets are adaptive. You might have an overall amount that you have agreed is going to be the cap about how much will be spent, but the exact line items, whether you spend it on flip chart markers or fuel for your motorbike or whatever, those things don't matter as much. There's a lot more flexibility in there, focused on creating value and understanding that overhead is a normal part of doing meaningful work. So this is sort of what I mean by the language of money. Now, the WWF example is also interesting. You didn't see a video on it, but the Open Innovation Lab also started with a question, and it also engaged multiple stakeholders to experiment. But the reason that lab was able to get funded was not because WWF happened to have a great relationship with a specific donor, but because WWF Switzerland gets more than half its money from private donors who have very high trust with the organization. So basically they say, do whatever you want, WWF, I trust you as long as you're working on conservation. And essentially that creates a source of revenue that also speaks the language of complexity, as long as that's what WWF is speaking. So the money is there, and it's not there's a single person defining what its priorities are, but the flexibility is there. And the important thing to recognize also about both these examples is that it wasn't just about the funder saying, hey, here's money, I want to innovate with it. It was about a two-way relationship. And this is why I think the language frame is interesting. It's not just about it's not just one-sided. It's about the discussion that exists between the leader of the change and the funder of the change. Because both of them are asking these types of questions, and they're both going back and forth and having empathy with each other's perspectives. So, and I would say that this sort of money language that is focused on questions rather than answers is the exception and not the norm. So I basically have two propositions about what I think needs to change. So one, the first revolution that we need is that we need a whole lot more money available, I think, for solving the systemic challenges we face. Climate change is a great example. The amount of money that's available currently being deployed on that is probably not enough, even though that's debatable. Maybe it's not the best example. But generally, I think, as a society, we need to be more willing to spend money to solve problems. That's the first revolution. The second one is that we need to have more money go to funding questions. We need more money in our systems that are able to speak the language of funding questions rather than only funding answers. So this first revolution is pretty hard. I don't really know how you change the human condition to make people more willing to invest in things that are important for the whole world and not just for themselves. But the next question is, what about the second revolution? How can we change our systems of money to go from funding questions to funding answers to funding questions? So I don't know. I don't know what that revolution looks like or how to create it. but I think it might have some ingredients, which in the 20 minutes we have left, I hope we can have some discussion about what this might look like. So, I mean, one thing is that I think we need more funders and investors that speak the language of complexity. So not just with their words, but also with the way they spend their money. And I have an example here. One of the initiatives I've worked on called the Energy Circle is an emergent initiative in Canada focused on empowering Canada's Indigenous leaders to lead the renewable energy development in their own communities. Right now, there's a lot of renewable energy development happening in Indigenous Canadian communities, but most of it's being owned and led by companies that are not Indigenous. Some of them are oil companies, a lot of them are NGOs or renewable energy companies based in big cities that mostly have white people, honestly, running them. So how do you actually get this renewable energy transition, where a lot of these communities are dependent on diesel right now, to be led by Indigenous people themselves? And this is a topic of great interest to a lot of people, and I spoke to one foundation about this in Vancouver, who was speaking the language of complexity with their words. They were saying, yeah, we want to experiment, we want to focus on relationships, we want to learn and adapt, and where you end up a year from now does not have to be where you need to end up today. That's the types of things that they would say, but as soon as it came down to actually talking about money, will you invest in this? Everything came right back to funding answers. Okay, well, what exactly do you want to do? When will it happen? When will the results be? Who will do what when? So the experimental, complex sort of values disappeared as soon as the money got involved. And this is pretty common. So I think we need more funders and investors that are willing to speak the language of complexity. I think the other thing is, for people who are trying to lead these types of things, community organizers, people who are trying to convene labs, who are aiming to support their communities to innovate for themselves and provide resources for them, need to be explicit and show leadership to their funders or the potential funders. And there's a few ways to do that. Instead of writing proposals for specific plans for projects, you can write proposals that talk about processes, the people you'll engage, and the challenge statements. So instead of saying, I'm going to build a treatment center, you can say, I'm going to experiment around the question, how can we address addiction in our community? There's also ways of innovating on accountability. One of the big reasons why donors and investors are so obsessed with a specific plan is because they want to be able to hold you accountable. But there are other ways that you can be held accountable other than adhering to a specific plan. You can, for example, talk about, you can, for example, basically track how you pivoted and why you changed direction, and then agree on an accountability process that makes that very clear, instead of necessarily going to the specific plan and the specific line item in the budget. Sharing stories about change and talking about how that change needed you to be experimental as opposed to planned is very helpful. You can provide funders with scenarios. So maybe you say, I'm starting this here and I don't know where I'm going to be 5 years from now, but you can maybe give 3 or 4 scenarios about where you might be, just to give your funder or potential investor an idea of the type of evolution that you envision without constraining yourselves to do just one thing. And then finally, I think a big part of speaking the language of funding questions rather than answers comes down to the trust that you have between the person who's investing and the person who's getting the money. And a lot of that trust is about empathizing with each other's constituencies. So if you come into a funding relationship and you acknowledge that your challenge, that you have a certain group of people that you think about when you think about what's important with your project, and the funder has a board and they have the family at home and they have people that they're thinking about, and actually acknowledge the tension there, why they might have they might have different values and priorities, and actually talk about that and use it as a source of creativity as opposed to just pretending that everyone's on the same page. a lot of the groups that I work with who've succeeded at really innovating around questions have mobilized their own economic power. Of course, not everyone can do this. Not everyone has economic power to mobilize. But for groups that have for-profit parts of what they do, for example, consulting, for instance, they can use the profits of that to invest in their own work. And this is basically what WWF has done, in that they have economic power and that they have this discretionary, flexible funding from the public. Take advantage of place-based bias. So what I mean by this is you often find that place-based foundations, so like the Chicago Community Trust, for example, are much more willing to innovate. So the government of New Zealand was also very willing to innovate because basically it's a small country and they happen to acknowledge that they have very specific issues that they don't know how to address. And that's easier to find people who have that type of willingness to take risks if the scope is small. So if you're working in Chicago, don't go to the federal government. Look for a community foundation in Chicago. Of course, there aren't enough of these, which is why I think we need this revolution. There aren't enough of these place-based foundations and sources of revenue that are willing to innovate in this way. But where they are, it's important to take advantage of them. And I don't know if part of the solution to this challenge is crowdfunding. Is it possible to create a crowdfunding platform that is designed around funding questions and experimentation as opposed to funding answers? Start Some Good is an interesting platform for this potentially. I don't know what impact it will end up having. This is potentially a solution, but I don't really know. And I'm at Republica, so people here probably know a lot more about the blockchain than I do. But I keep hearing about how the blockchain is going to transform money. I don't totally understand how. I mean, I've read all of the literature on it, but I don't really get what's actually going to happen. So maybe there's a solution in blockchain here. Maybe somehow we hack money, and that's what changes how it behaves and what it values. But I don't know. And we have, 15 minutes for discussion. I don't know the answers here. All I basically can tell you is what I've experienced and what the people that I work with worry about and why their lives are difficult, their professional lives are difficult. So I've come here hoping to maybe generate some learning from the group and get some discussion going, hoping that with the framing that I provided, you'll be able to share some ideas about how to solve these challenges. So, discussion. Thank you for listening.
Hi, Mike. I'm Ken. I live and work in South Africa.
Hi.
A question related to the rigid nature of obtaining funding and how...
Of what funding, sorry?
Of obtaining.
Obtaining funding, yeah.
Getting it. You know, if a major funder releases a call for proposals and you're just a small NGO bidding for that, you really have to follow the criteria set out by that proposal.
Yeah.
But even if you agree that you want to change it and change the nature of the discussion, how would you advise on making this change happen and advertising that change and then being able to successfully obtain funding through the more open, transparent and not so rigid process? Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, that's the real trick, right? So this is kind of what I mean when I say that most of our funding institutions are designed around funding answers rather than questions. Like that very rigid structure is designed to minimize risk and to maximize predefined knowledge about what will happen, right? And what the risks are. So I think that's really the challenge. I mean, I think that the fact that you've got this very rigid budget that says do this, then that, then that, then this, is exactly what I mean when we need to change our language of money. Basically, I think that that call for proposals needs to look different. That's the world that I want. However, that's not the world that we have. And a lot of the clients that I work with have this type of challenge. And one of the things that we've found is you can do is kind of trick the system into working for you by basically being very tactical about where you're specific and where you're vague. So you can be very specific about certain things in the proposal, for example, about things that you can be specific about, maybe what your core team is, or about what the first thing is that you're going to do. But then when they ask for, what's your plan, you can actually put in the plan section a process and a series of engagements that you're going to do with people, and then that's the plan, even though it's not a plan, it's a process, but you've called a process a plan just to fit their language. So speaking the language that they want and then hoping that you get a good grant officer. But I don't think it's possible to solve that problem completely unless the character of the funding and the values that inform the funding change.
Hi, I'm Everett from the Philippines. I have a question later on, but I'll context it like this. Usually the source of funds can either be the investor, which are interested in returns, or the donors, the development donors maybe, who are interested in results. So either way, I think in my perspective, this actually is the root of this thing, the way they fund more answers. See? So, as you mentioned when you answered Ken here, is that usually people, those that are looking for funding for questions are tailoring their language to fit this language. Yeah. Have you ever had concrete experience of the other way around, of these investors actually being recruited into funding, actively recruited into funding more questions, like practical examples? They may not necessarily be there yet, but are there any groups of people or initiatives that are actively seeking to change the investor's mind? Yeah, so there are things. I mean, I'd have to get back to you on the specifics, but I have come across things like this. So there, I mean, but the thing is, there are an exception. So there's a SOCAP group, Social Capital group is convening a lab around this very question, actually, or it's more like a series of workshops around basically how do we make socially informed investing the norm rather than the exception in the global financial markets. So they're trying to change that. It's still going to be mostly about funding answers, though. It's really more about the first revolution, the one about the amount of money that goes into social things rather than the type of money. But then you've got basically foundations themselves that are leading on it. So the Chicago Community Trust actually had a very interesting sort of mission statement where they say, we aim to provide the consistency of service that is expected while also having the boldness and courage to innovate given the times we live in, or something like that. So basically, they're very much interested in funding questions. And they were already doing that even before the Grove thing came along. And then they sort of set an example for other foundations. But as far as I know, is there any initiative that's out there trying to basically shift social investing from funding answers to funding questions, or to add a greater proportion of questions? I don't think so. That's part of why Suresh and I were working on it, because eventually we were hoping to convene a larger scale effort around that idea. But if there is, and anyone knows about it, please tell me, because I would love to know those people. Other thoughts? Doesn't necessarily just need to be questions for me either, like comments or reflections. Anything that you've got on your mind, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, I think I can share because I work with communities that live along the river in the Amazon region. So when I apply for funding, when I do not know what the needs are, usually they need, what are you doing? So I have to give all the structure. So usually I do the things, the prototypes and the things that the grant is asking. Yeah. But at the end I save some money because I have to do all the research of what's happening behind, right. Like what are the needs, because of the influence of big companies in this region is huge, and the culture that has been lost. Right. So I agree. I think for me it's still difficult to see where to find ways. But also there is a Inspiral that is from New Zealand, and they do this work where they have a budget that is for social good. So all the money, the profit that they receive from this cooperative, they put in a fund, and then they decide where to go the money.
Right.
So it's growing, and I appreciate, this comment.
Hello. My question is, how do you show the impact or the value or the benefit such initiatives generate? The benefits which obviously go beyond the financial. Yeah. Are there any models for this, like models for measuring impact of such activity?
Yeah. Yeah, there are lots actually. There's a lot of work on being done on evaluating complex interventions, basically. So there's the 5 capitals framework is one that was used with Chicago actually in this integrated reporting model. I wish I had the report I could show you. But basically they said, okay, our results are defined in terms of 5 different types of capital: financial capital, human capital, natural capital, social capital, and physical capital, I guess. Yeah, so those are the 5. And then of course you're not creating any natural capital because you're not, making new forests or anything, but you're creating financial capital, you're creating social capital because you're creating new relationships, new trust, new capacity, or human capital, new capacity in the system. So basically you can, I think a big driving force behind this is the need to reduce things to numbers. People love numbers. They want to know how many, how much. And I don't know, if there's any way beyond that in the human mind. I think stories help, but at the end of the day, you still want to know how much. Like, was this story happen once or 10,000 times? That you still want to know, right? So the capitals framework helps you do that. So what they did with Grove in Chicago was basically just come up with a general points system where they said, okay, if 2 people participated in a workshop, we're going to give that interaction 10 points. If they collaborated on a prototype, we'll give that interaction 100 points. And of course, the points are, what do they mean, right? But they've tried to find a way of kind of bridging this gap between this very emergent space and this very rigid one. And I think they did a pretty good job, and it helps that they had a great relationship with the funder who was willing to think outside the box, kind of. There's also tons of other work on this. But I could give you my card and I could share some resources with you. There's a whole field of people trying to figure out this question.
Hi, so my question was, when someone is trying to receive funding, how can the funder pick between several candidates? I mean, you said at the beginning that for complex problems, each time you essentially have to start from scratch, so it's not necessarily possible to extrapolate from past experience of a candidate.
Yeah.
So was what you were talking about earlier, could that help in this respect, or do we need to do some research to figure out if there are particular characteristics of an organization that would make it more capable to tackle systemic problems?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It kind of reminds me of the reason why the GRE, like those standardized testing for entrance into American universities, is always there, because even though everyone knows these tests are like really stupid and they don't tell you anything about how smart the person is, they still use them because they need something. Like they need something to compare people against, right? So yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think I have an opinion about that. I think there are characteristics you can identify around how well networked the organization is, what kind of a track record it has of having innovated or changed directions and that kind of stuff. But I think that would be a good topic for research and development, actually, is like what you know, if there are certain criteria that are being used right now that funders use to decide whether you're worthy of, whether this is a good investment, what are the different ones? What are the new ones that we need? And there's going to be things about, yeah, capacity to change and the networks and teams and leadership and that kind of stuff. But actually defining that clearly would be helpful. Yeah. Anything else?
Hello. I just wanted to make a remark on this because the discussion seemed quite similar to how artists work actually, because very often it's always about the process of the work and about, I suppose, coming up with something new, or I guess you have to try to convince someone else to give you funding to try to make something new, and how does that come along? And I suppose, I mean, I could also give the example of like Picasso, who there was someone who asked him to do a portrait of them, and for I think it was 3 months or so he was supposed to be working on it, and it turns out that he actually didn't work on it, and on the day when the client came in, he said sit down, and then he did the portrait and he gave it to them for the amount that so there might be some correlation between these two, and it might be interesting to see where those might match up.
Right, yeah. That'd be a great story to tell, by the way. If you're sitting down with a funder and you're like, no, look, we got to focus on questions, not answers. The answers will come, but we have to start with the question. Then tell the Picasso story, and then the money will flow, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yes, Mike, thank you for sharing. Wow, what a broad and yet deep topic. Very interesting. Thank you. I think you will share cards, and everyone who still has questions will find Mike here outside. We will have a 15 minutes break, and then we'll keep on going.
Thank you, everybody.